This is Josh Friedman in Dnipropetrovsk, Ukraine, now known simply as Dnipro, following the adoption of Ukraine's anti-communism law. Today I'm going to be discussing North Korea's nuclear weapons program within the context of Ukraine and Russia, and information warfare and possibly hybrid warfare that Russia is accused of carrying out inside Ukraine. Behind me is a Soviet-era weapons, or I should say machine manufacturer. This is the headquarters of the manufacturer. That's called Yuzhmash. Yuzhmash is basically an abbreviation in Russian and Ukrainian for South Machine. The plant is basically named the Southern Machine Building Factory. This was a key part of Dnipropetrovsk back during Soviet times. During Soviet times, Dnipropetrovsk was a manufacturing hub, and it was specifically a center for defense manufacturing. And within the defense industry, this Yuzhmash factory, which is headquartered behind me, was a major player. This is said to be where the first nuclear-armed rocket was, a Soviet nuclear-armed rocket was built. And the reason I'm here right now is because even though this factory is dilapidated and said to be going underwater financially, it is back in the news, or at least last month it was making international headlines. That's because a London-based think tank called the International Institute of Strategic Studies put out a paper that basically ID'd Yuzhmash as the most likely source for North Korean leader Kim Jong-un's new nuclear weapons program advancements. This report was saying that a liquid propellant engine that North Korea was using in its recent missile tests was most likely to have come from a Yuzhmash factory. However, that was said with the context that the rocket engine was most likely to have come from illicit sources in Russia and Ukraine, and it specifically identified this factory, or a factory within the Yuzhmash agency, which is now a Ukrainian state-owned factory. But it was identified in part because this factory does manufacture the type of, or had manufactured the type of rocket engine used in the North Korean tests, but also the speculation was that because the employees here are so impoverished, they might have the financial motive to work with some illicit players who would then transfer the engine to North Korea. Now, the Russian government seized on this story, and that was largely to do because the report was covered by the New York Times. The New York Times put out an article that basically said that Yuzhmash, or a Ukrainian plant, had been identified as the most likely source of Kim Jong-un's nuclear weapons program advancements. Now, that could be a little misleading. I have read the report, and I tried to explain to you just seconds ago that the report first discussed that it's most likely that some sort of illicit group or groups within Russian Ukraine transferred the rocket engine to North Korea, and only then did it get into Yuzhmash and Yuzhmash's financial troubles, which really briefly I'll explain that when the Cold War ended, production here was scaled down dramatically, and then in recent years, as Russia and Ukraine have effectively broken ties in defense cooperation and other areas, the workload decreased here even further, and the people here who are working are said to be making very little money. So that was part of the context of the report and the speculation of how Yuzhmash employees could be involved. Now, both Yuzhmash as a firm and the Ukrainian government came out and adamantly denied the New York Times report and bashed the New York Times report, stating clearly that Ukraine has absolutely no cooperation with North Korea and its nuclear weapons program. And then on top of that, there are allegations that this was information warfare on the part of Moscow, in that it was either planting a story or spinning a story so as to place blame on Ukraine as a state and a country for the delivery of rocket engines to North Korea. Now, some will even take that a step further and accuse the Russian state of being directly involved in the delivery of rocket engines to North Korea, with speculation being that Russia has interest in the North Korean-American standoff escalating, and just in general doing anything to cause harm and struggles for Washington. Now, all this speculation aside, this does give you a glimpse or a glance at information warfare in Ukraine. And to add to that, I'm going to go back to yesterday when I was discussing the series of mysterious bombings that were taking place in Kharkiv in late 2014 and early 2015. Ever since the conflict heated up between Ukraine and Russia, there have been numerous incidents of very shady things occurring, and often violent things occurring, like those bombings in Kharkiv. And something else like that happened just this week. Yesterday morning, or rather late the night before, there was a large explosion or explosions at a munitions plant in central Ukraine, and that caused a huge fire, which led to the evacuation of thousands of people and the destruction of who knows how much munition that was at that plant. And as is the case with most of these bombings that have been occurring in Ukraine, we're probably not going to get to the bottom of it. We're probably not going to know concretely who was behind this explosion at the munitions plant. And Ukraine, as is the case, usually is hinting that Russia was behind it. The Ukrainian officials they haven't outright blamed Russia for this latest explosion, but they've hinted at Moscow being behind it. And of course, with this issue with the rocket engine going to North Korea, things like that give an opportunity for Russia to hint at the Ukrainian government being up to nefarious stuff, or rather than that, at Ukraine being so dysfunctional as a state, a country, and a society that it would let some poor factory worker strike up a deal with criminal networks to transfer rocket engines to North Korea. So that's a way for Russia to discredit Ukraine through information warfare, regardless of whether the allegation is true or not. These are some examples of the concrete information warfare that's taking place in Ukraine nowadays, and it's probably part of hybrid warfare in that there is obviously fighting in the east, and like I mentioned yesterday, fighting has spread a bit elsewhere in the country. There are bombings taking place now and then. There have been a series of car bombings in Kiev. I mean, so there's all this violence that's taking place, and there's efforts by Kiev dependent on Moscow, and efforts by Moscow dependent on Kiev. And without me delving into or speculating on who is really at fault or who is more at fault, it's just an opportunity to look at this very murky situation that is the conflict between Ukraine and Russia. And because there are such large tensions between the West and Russia, it's a way to examine the hybrid and information warfare that's arguably taking place between the West and Russia, not just Ukraine and Russia. So my trip to Dnipro, I want to say Dnipropetrovsk, my trip to Dnipro, unfortunately, is pretty short. Like I said yesterday, my time in Ukraine, and for that matter, September, is coming to an end. But I figured rather than taking a look at the river the city is named after the Dnipro River, that's why it's Dnipro. Rather than taking a look at the river, the scenery, the churches, and the city center, I thought with my limited time, what better place to come than to something that really gets at the core of what Dnipropetrovsk, the Soviet city, was about, and frankly, for that matter, what this city of 1 million people is grappling with now. If Dnipro is in a post-industrial state, then it's probably hurting, because this city was known for industry, and specifically manufacturing and defense, like I discussed beforehand. And I think tourists were not even let into this city until the 90s, after the Soviet Union collapsed. I guess that gives you an idea of just what this city was about. Well, I haven't unfortunately been inside the plant. I walked to the very entrance around that way, so I got to peek in a little bit, but I haven't done any investigating. Reuters recently visited here and published a piece about how indeed the workers here are impoverished and morale is very low, and this plant does not look like it's gonna make it financially. So that gives you a lot of context to the hybrid warfare and the information warfare, and like I said, it was a fitting place for me to visit in my limited time in Dnipro, Ukraine. So that's enough with Kim Jong-un and the North Korean weapons program, as well as hybrid and information warfare. I am now going to, tonight on a night train, I expect to be heading down to Odessa, which will be my first and final stop during this September trip around Ukraine, and I'll give you one last shout out from there, and goodbye for now from Dnipro, Ukraine, outside Yuzhmash headquarters.